Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Everyday Anarchism. This is part of my continuing series on radicalism in the English Revolution. This is an episode that I did not have conceived originally, but one of my two guests today, Nigel Smith, suggested we should do an episode on Milton when we were talking about the Ranters. So you probably remember Nigel from the Ranters episode. So with me today are Nigel Smith and Nick McDowell to talk about Milton and radicalism. Nigel, do you want to reintroduce yourself to the listeners before we get started?
Sure. So I'm Nigel Smith. I teach English at Princeton University. I've lived in the United States for 25 years. Before that, I lived in the country of my birth, the UK, and used to teach at Oxford University. And it was in that time, really, that I became a scholar of early modern radicalism and of 17th century or early modern literature. In the beginning, very much English literature, but since I've been in the United States, I've taken a broader view and have looked at other developments in Europe in the same period and even further afield in the globe. It was my great privilege and honor to have Nick as my graduate student back in the 90s in Oxford.
All right. Well, I guess, Nick, Nigel has gotten your introduction started.
Yes. Okay. Thanks. Yes, indeed. Well, I'm Nick McDowell, and I teach English at Exeter University in the UK. I was born and grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, which first got me interested in religious and political conflict through direct experience. And then I went and studied in England and latterly with Nigel, and wrote a doctorate on the Ranters, the Diggers and the Levellers at Oxford. And then since then, I've been working increasingly on Milton, culminating in a two-volume intellectual biography, of which I've written the first part, and I'm currently finishing the second part.
Yes, this is where I jump in and say that this biography, Poet of Revolution, is excellent. I must admit I was disappointed when I first got it because I didn't know it was only half of a biography. So when I acquired it, I thought it was a complete biography. And then I thought, oh no, this is twice as much reading. But it's really a pleasure to read, Nick. Thank you for writing this book.
Well, thank you. It wasn't supposed to be 2 volumes at the start, but it became 2 volumes.
Good. So you couldn't cover the life of Milton in a single volume, but now I'm going to ask you to cover the life of Milton in 5 to 10 minutes. And in particular, of course, for this podcast, if you can tell us, about his upbringing. I'm sure this is important stuff. It's impossible to avoid upbringing and people's place in the Protestant landscape. But what will be most important, I think, for the listeners is his role in the revolution, which maybe people who only know him as a poet do not know him as the poet of revolution.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I do think that for me is the most fascinating thing about Milton, is that he's not only one of the great, if perhaps the greatest English poet, but also more involved in his political and religious world than almost any other writer in English. So Milton was born in 1608 in London, so 3 years into the reign of King James I. And he was born into a fairly prosperous middle-class family. His father was a scrivener, someone who copied legal papers, and was also involved in some money lending as well, but certainly quite a well-off family without being aristocratic. And Milton himself grew up close to St. Paul's Cathedral, and he went, after being taught by some private tutors, which is a sign, I suppose, of his family's wealth, that his father was able to afford some private tutors who got him started on Latin and Greek, and seemingly Italian as well at that point. He went to St. Paul's School in London, where he was given a very rigorous education in the classics, in Latin and Greek literature, language and literature. And this is where, I guess, the seeds of his literary ambitions seem to have been sown. One of the most remarkable things about Milton is that he has a very strong conviction from, it seems, an early age, that he is going to write the greatest epic poem in English. And of course, it's easy to be skeptical or mock that, but of course he went on to do so. So a rare example of someone who fulfilled all his ambitions, but not without some serious bumps in the road along the way, of which he was very conscious. So after St. Paul's School, he went to Cambridge, Christ's College, Cambridge, where he was quite disappointed, it seems, in the level of the students around him. That's one of the sort of early refrains of his early writings, both in poetry and prose, most of which are in Latin. He bemoans the fact that his fellow students don't work as hard as they should. And this, I think, it's partly comic, but it becomes a kind of serious, kind of political and religious point for Milton, that those people who waste their talents, their God-given talents, is a kind of sign of moral feeling. And that also leads to feelings in politics and religion in the state. So I think, and I've tried to argue in the first volume of my biography, that you can't follow a thread from this kind of early educational experience at school and then at university, and his kind of growing disenchantment with large swathes of the English people. So he's quite prominent as a Latin poet at Cambridge, but not one of the most celebrated names of his era. And he stays on to do an MA at Cambridge, which gives him a lot more freedom to move around. And he seems to have spent a lot of time in London and back home, as well as in Cambridge. And then he leaves Cambridge, and this is probably the most remarkable thing of his early life. And again, this is the wealth of his family allows him to do this. He spends the next 5-6 years on a personal reading course, reading as much as he can in preparation for becoming the great epic poet that he so long desired to be. And he gets this idea from it's a conventional Renaissance topos or topic that you need to read almost everything you can to prepare yourself to become the poet of epic, which is considered the most universal and compendious of all literary genres. So he sets about doing this, and then he goes on a trip to Italy as well, a kind of little mini. He goes away for about 18 months, so it's a reasonably long trip through France into Italy, where he spends time in Rome and Florence, and meets people like Galileo and other luminaries of 17th century Europe. All the time, though, the conflict, the rise of civil war in England is becoming more and more apparent to people. And when he returns from Italy, having written at this point a couple of his best known poems, Lycidas, a great funeral elegy for his friend Edward King, who died drowned in the Irish Sea, and also a masque, a kind of dramatic theatrical entertainment called Comus. So he had written some significant works by that point, but if he had died, say, on his trip back from Italy, how we would have remembered him is a good question. Whether, how much we would have read, still be reading those early works, and how much it depends on what he writes later. But he comes back from Italy, and this is where there's a crucial point in his biography, I think, what leads him then to become increasingly interested in the politics of the English Civil War as it breaks out in the early 1640s, and that's something we may talk about in the rest of this podcast, because it's a point of contention, exactly what radicalized Milton to take up the parliamentarian side in the English Civil War between the King and Parliament. And then he also launches a career as a polemical prose writer in English. And he follows that through much of the early 1640s and becomes involved in very vitriolic and bitter polemical prose conflicts. And again, we might come back to that period. He writes about topics like divorce, and some of his more radical ideas start to appear at this time under the pressure of the development of the Civil War. He goes quiet for a few years as the Civil War comes to an end and Parliament is victorious. But then in 1649, Parliament executes Charles I after failing to come to the kind of terms that they wish to come with the defeated king. And Milton immediately jumps back in. He's one of the earliest. His is the earliest and most radical defense of the execution of Charles I. So he's clearly, doesn't come from nowhere. He's clearly been thinking about this. And even though it's not necessarily explicitly apparent in his earlier works, he immediately steps in and defends the regicide. He gets noticed by the new Republican government, and they appoint him Secretary for Foreign Tongues, essentially a civil servant, but also a polemicist. And he goes on, he works for the Republic through the early 1650s, writing both English and Latin polemical prose works, defending the new Republic, both to English speakers and to those in Europe through his Latin works. Also, crucially, he goes completely blind in 1652, which obviously can't be underestimated as an effect on his personality and his sense of himself. But it seems that he turned this blindness into a positive by thinking of himself as being a prophetic figure at this point, someone whose blindness is compensated for by divine illumination. And I think this is the beginning of the origins of his great epic poem, Paradise Lost, at least as we have it. He'd been planning, as I say, to write an epic poem for many years, but the idea of writing on religious material, biblical material, seems to develop around the mid-1650s. And he starts to write Paradise Lost around 1658, or I should say dictate Paradise Lost to people who then take down his words, a remarkable phenomenon. He also continues to work throughout the 1650s for Oliver Cromwell, who in 1653 to 4 becomes Lord Protector and basically dissolves the Republican Parliament and becomes, well, in some people's eyes, a king in all but name, some other people's eyes, a tyrant. How Milton?
Let me break in,
yes,
Nick, and assure you that we have covered this question extensively. It's probably the most popular question in this series.
Okay.
How do we read Cromwell and his revolutionary role?
Right. Well, we'll come back to that, no doubt.
That's a very interesting question.
Indeed. And so how Milton perceives Cromwell, again, as a matter of some controversy, especially in those later 1650s. And we may discuss that. When Oliver Cromwell dies, Charles II, Charles I's son, returns. The Stuart monarchy is restored in 1660. Milton has to go into hiding because of his association with the Republican regime. It seems he's briefly imprisoned, but is let go, is not punished like some of the others who were directly responsible for the regicide and executed. But it seems that he's let go on the understanding that he will not continue in any way with his explicit political writings. And it's this point then he finishes Paradise Lost, 10,500 lines of epic blank verse poetry, so non-rhyming verse, on the fall of man, Adam and Eve, and their temptation in Eden by Satan. On, of course, in which his reputation rests, and we'll hear from Nigel in a moment about what's so amazing about Paradise Lost as a poem. And he continues then to write a couple of other significant poems. Paradise Regained, which we may come back to, is not quite a sequel to Paradise Lost, despite the title. And Samson Agonistes is about the Old Testament figure Samson. Two shorter, there's still quite longish poems, narrative poems, but shorter than Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost was published 1667, with a second edition 1674, and Milton dies in 1674. And his reputation after that relies, not surprisingly, I suppose, people want to think about Paradise Lost much more than they want to think about his reputation and involvement with the Republic, his reputation as a regicide defender. So that side of his life is left to one side for many years, really, or overshadowed by people's desire to see him as the great English epic poet, which indeed is what he set out to do in the first place. So I'll leave it there. Much more to say, but I think I've said enough for now, and that'll give us some material to think about.
Oh, no, that was wonderful, Nick. Of course, there's more to say. I now need to say something I meant to say earlier, that I first read Paradise Lost as an undergraduate at the University of South Carolina with a professor named Larry Rue, who has been on this podcast and is probably the single figure who shaped my ways of thinking about, honestly, about everything. People have heard episodes on Cavell, but also who I studied with Larry. But one of the earliest episodes of this podcast was about divorce, and I used Milton on that, which was something I encountered with Larry as well. I think as a junior, and so I have been thinking about this poem in terms of its literary greatness and its theological significance and its place in ideas about rebellion and revolution for more than 20 years now, I had not, in all of this time, really thought about it, honestly, until your book came out, Nick, as a something that is in dialogue with something that came out of the experiences of a man who set out to be an epic poet in this tradition of, I imagine people know these people, Virgil and Homer, but also was a defender of regicide and a contemporary of Oliver Cromwell. And so bringing this poet and thinker who I've been studying for 20 years together with some people like the Ranters and Gerard Winstanley is just absolutely thrilling to me. And I really appreciate the two of you being here to do this.
May I ask you, as I start, if that was new to you in coming to Milton and radicalism, that when you were at University of South Carolina, Milton as a radical was not put before you, as it were?
No. I mean, honestly, Nigel, when I started this project and went back and discovered, that sort of Godwin is the first anarchist, and that sort of makes Shelley the second and third anarchists. And I thought, what the hell? How many classes on British literature did I take as an undergraduate without anyone mentioning political radicalism to me? Certainly philosophical radicalism, Larry Rue and I did enormously, but yeah, I was 38 before I started thinking of these people as political radicals, which is why I wanted to bring you in to talk about the literary nature of this. Yes, go ahead, Nigel.
To pick up the story from where Nick has left off. So, pretty quickly in English letters, which are not full of radicals by any means, although there are some, but not very many. And the most active literary figures in the decades after Milton died, diehard royalists, one way or another. But nonetheless, Paradise Lost was recognized as the major, world-class piece of literary endeavor that Milton had hoped it would be. And it rapidly got a high reputation, certainly in England, which would soon become the unified Kingdom of England and Scotland, and also in parts of continental Europe. So it was translated fairly quickly by a German-speaking resident in London, and became known in that's the first of many or several translations into German from the later 17th century. So in a way, Milton and Shakespeare become kind of German authors during the course of the 18th century. And also there's an early translation into Italian. So, and during the course of the 18th century, it's fair to say Milton becomes an internationally known poet. And inside the English-speaking world, becomes the most imitated poet, drives the course of poetry itself. I should say non-dramatic poetry, of course. So lyrical poetry and epic tends to be written in the footprint of Milton. Very, very, very famously, Wordsworth's Prelude is, in a sense, a poetic autobiography written through a deep, profound allusion to Paradise Lost. But that's the tip of the iceberg. And this goes on through the 19th century, where Milton is the master poet, until the modernists arrive, and especially T.S. Eliot, who basically feel they have to break Milton's reputation to write a different kind of poetry. In other words, to to assert their own originality. And this involves a famous essay by Eliot, Milton 1, in which he rails against Miltonic verse. And this begins another, is associated with another movement, the English critic associated with Cambridge, although he was as it were, a satanic rebel in his day in Cambridge. This is F.R. Leavis, who claimed in another essay, a little bit after Eliot, that Milton was a kind of un-English poet. Eliot recanted, and there was a recuperation of Milton in the beginning, I think, in the mid-17th century. And this is very much in British letters and to some extent in American letters. And then a growing, serious, profound, extensive academic interest in Milton as Milton becomes widely taught, especially Paradise Lost, with the expansion of the subject of English. Now, that's literature, and we still have Milton sitting pretty high, although I don't think he's read as much as he was, say, in 1900, where people who read literature would read him as much as they would read Shakespeare. And the fact that Shakespeare is easy to get to through performance and Paradise Lost you have to read is, I think, the source of the difference. Going back to Milton's political and religious views, he was on the losing side. The English Republic failed, and the kinds of religious innovation that he stood for, we can call it, just for the sake of brevity, radical Puritanism, didn't succeed and was occluded, to some extent outlawed, when the monarchy returned, and by some acts of Parliament in 1662, which re-established the Church of England. And so Milton is persona non grata, and as Nick has already told us, and his reputation is as a regicidal Republican thinker, for which he was not forgiven. And I think that that view holds strongly during the 18th century. And with the triumph of parliamentary democracy in the 19th century, which is seen to be behind the rise of Great Britain as a world power, then Milton is recuperated as a kind of liberal figure, a father of liberalism. So religious toleration, and against tyrants and tyrannical monarchs who regard themselves as impune and resistant to any kind of mission or counsel that might lead them to change course. And that's why there's a difference. There's a different reception of Milton in America than there is in Great Britain. In Great Britain, there is always a sense of distrust, disapproval, or if you're sympathetic to Milton, you acknowledge that he said some and stood for some very, very powerful things. He can certainly become your revolutionary hero if you want to make him so. All the better, because he's a poet. But I don't think anyone in England escapes from the fact that he justified the execution of a monarch. Let us not forget that Great Britain still is a constitutional monarchy, and a new king, after a very long reign of a queen, ascended to the throne last year. And I do believe it's very hard to to put the English Republic and the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell into the public sphere without encountering pushback. And it's very hard to have exhibitions about the achievements of the English Republic, or to explore whether or not it had an iconography in art. So in the UK, or Great Britain as it used to be more commonly known, there is that doubleness: great poet, dangerous. On the other hand, in the United States, Milton was, when the revolution arrived in 1776, quickly appropriated as a forerunner, a forebear, an ancestor, and somebody whose writings could be seized upon in the name of the freedoms which the new American Republic and the Americans, as they refused the monarchy of King George III, fought for. And that leaves the study of Milton and sympathy with Milton in a completely different light. I think Americans have always been far readier. First of all, they're far readier to countenance Milton's prose writings and be interested in them. I don't think any of Milton's prose writings are quoted on any public monument in the United Kingdom, but a sentence from Areopagitica is graven on the entrance to the New York Public Library. What about that? I mean, that is amazing. That is amazing to a Brit. And the Milton Society of America, which I believe was founded either in the late 19th or the very early 20th century, is perhaps the oldest or one of the oldest societies within the Modern Language Association. And it was the focal point for the scholars who basically gave us the modern massive editions of Milton in multi-volume editions, which has made the serious scholarship of Milton possible. And on the prose side, one thinks in particular of the Yale prose edition, which was edited by Don M. Wolfe. He was the first and founding editor. It was very much a kind of American tolerationist project with respect for the radicals. Wolfe wrote about the Levelers as well and taught them. He was an English professor, but he taught the radicals. That was common at the time. And it wasn't really until the 1970s into the 80s that the English and the American critics and scholars of Milton actually got together in regular conferences with the rise of the International Milton Symposium. So that makes it sound as though it's become very academic. I don't believe that's entirely true. I think Milton is read by the general reading public. I wrote a public-facing book on Milton, and I receive every so often an unsolicited email, usually telling me what a great book it is and how it opened somebody's eyes to Milton. And please, could I explain the following lines? It's not wise to answer these, but they do arrive, and they give me some sense that there is interest out there in Milton. Whether Milton's particular version of Christianity, which in itself would have been regarded in the 17th century by almost everyone as heretical, to what extent that would go down well with in the evangelical churches today in the south of the US is a matter for debate. But there are lots of there's lots of evidence that Paradise Lost and some of the prose texts, some of the other poetry were read in colonial New England and the early Republic and venerated. I think preachers traveling in New England, reading Paradise Lost, sometimes in preference to the Bible. And there is a colleague who is convinced that the Mormons and Joseph Smith and some of his followers had a particular interest in Paradise Lost as a source for their version. In their theology, Satan as fallen angel is a significant figure. I don't know very much about that, but it's very interesting.
All right. So one thing I want to say, taking up with what you said, and then we can turn over to this fallen angel thing. So the first thing to say is, I thought it was very interesting when you described Milton as sort of remembered as a sort of founder of parliamentary democracy, because that sounds to me very similar to how the levelers are now remembered. They were radicals in their time, but when you get to the 19th century, I mean, this is still the thing you hear about the levelers in the 21st century is, oh, look, they pretty much wanted the system we have. Whether or not that's true, that's the thing that you see said about them. The only other thing I wanted to say, and maybe we can turn this back over to Nick. I mean, Nick, you brought up a lot of things that we need to go back to, but I'm not sure we've yet explained to anyone that Satan is the hero of Paradise Lost, which obviously it's a little more complicated than that. But to understand how this text is so clearly a radical one, it has to do with the role of the devil, the adversary, and he's placed in the heroic place in this tradition. So I wonder if you could take that up and maybe, if you can, tie that into Milton's thoughts on politics and radicalism.
Yeah, well, that's getting to the heart of, I suppose, the thing about Paradise Lost that's fascinated readers from the beginning, and certainly the Romantics in particular, Blake and Shelley, who we mentioned earlier. I guess really established the notion that somehow Satan was the true hero of Paradise Lost, and everybody has their own version of this. I mean, I would say he's the hero, but in a very specific sense, and he's a kind of classical hero, in the footsteps of Odysseus or various characters from Homeric epic. But of course, Milton's writing a Christian poem at the end, not a pagan one, and so I think that's one thing. I mean, the one of the most famous interpretations of Paradise Lost was put forward by Stanley Fish, who is still going strong, a well-known kind of academic and intellectual in the US, who suggested that Milton was deliberately enticing readers into admiring the figure of Satan, only to show them how wrong they are, so they could fall themselves in the same way that Eve falls for Satan's satanic temptation. And that's quite it's a strong argument that nobody's entirely, I think, completely overturned, despite a lot of discussion of it. But I think there's certainly the case that the Milton, one of the features of Paradise Lost that is endlessly fascinating is the way that Milton builds in, especially in the early books of the poem. He starts with Satan and the fallen angels, not with Adam and Eve. And to start with Satan and the fallen angels immediately allows us to see something from their perspective. And of course, they've just led a rebellion, a civil war against God in heaven. And naturally, given Milton's biography that we've just discussed, people then discover, readers want to know, is this Milton reflecting back on his own experience of rebellion? Is there sympathy with Satan, sympathy for the devil, or is he in some way rejecting his previous radical politics? Or is it much more complicated than that, all of that put together? I think what is crucial, and following what Nigel said actually, and what you said, I mean, I think that dichotomy between, you can't understand Paradise Lost without, you can't understand it fully, I think, without getting some sense of how it emerged from Milton's own experiences of civil war and actual conflict, although he never saw battle himself, but actual conflict scarring the landscape of England. And I think we have to see it in some sense as a reflection on that experience of civil war. but to see it as a kind of allegory is probably a mistake. It's not a one-to-one sort of Satan represents this, God represents another thing. Does one character represent Charles I? Does one represent Cromwell? I think they represent more abstract qualities than any one individual. And so it's more a reflection, I think, on the abuses of power, the attractions of rebellion and resistance, and how those can also lead to consequences that weren't foreseen. I know Nigel wants to step in here on the satanic Milton, but I do think there's been, even when I was an undergraduate, I studied Paradise Lost. I had virtually no idea that Milton had been involved in the historical events they'd been. I studied Paradise Lost in a kind of, sealed off context. When I got to work with Nigel, in fact, it's for the first time I got this revelation that, all of the Milton's life and his works existed in this very rich, complicated historical context. And so, I think that's still, even up until, comparatively recently, I think that kind of dichotomy between the sort of orthodox Milton and heterodox Milton, and the two of them not coming together, even structured, university programs.
Yeah. Before Nigel comes in, I just want to say I was certainly taught Milton in a tradition, two traditions really, the tradition of epic poetry and the tradition of, Puritan and more broader theology. So these are long traditions, longitudinal across time. What I wasn't taught was Milton within the context of his time. And yes, I don't want to do a simplistic allegory, but it does seem that he's responding to those ideas. The one last episode for this series that I have in mind is one on Hobbes. I don't know how many times I've been taught Hobbes. It's never been isolated. He's always been in a tradition, a long tradition through time that includes everyone from Plato to John Rawls. I was never taught Hobbes embedded in his time period. And that's actually what as soon as Nigel mentioned Milton, I knew I wanted to do this, and I knew within seconds that I wanted to do Hobbes as well, because these figures are, the Nietzschean metaphor is like islands or mountains that we connect them over time. We connect Hobbes to Locke, to Hume, to Stuart Mill, but we do not embed them in their time period. And that is why I brought you two here today. So go ahead, Nigel.
Yes. Well, I think actually just to pick you up on that point, but it's getting away from Milton. In the UK, there is a tradition, maybe more in history than in politics, of understanding Hobbes in his own time, in his own context, and I would say that the more original work on Hobbes has come from precisely that tradition, rather than seeing him in the great tradition of political thought from Plato to NATO, so to speak. But coming back to Milton, yes, I think Nick wanted me to say that, and then said it better than I could have done, that what is striking about Paradise Lost, the most important thing, is the sympathetic treatment of Satan at the beginning of the poem. That changes everything, so that you see Satan and his rebellion. You see the devil from inside his own eyes. And that is quite remarkable in literary tradition. And the second thing I think that happens is even though Milton from time to time is regarded as a misogynistic dead white male, there is nonetheless a relatively sympathetic treatment of Eve when we get to Adam and Eve, and a sympathetic view of their relationship, how they came to fall, how their innocent humanity was exploited, and how they dealt with it. And this is the eminent Harvard critic Stephen Greenblatt has written. One of his more recent books has been about the singular importance of Milton's treatment of Adam and Eve in the treatment of literary treatments of the fall. So that's another dimension, and it would take us to the important aspect of Milton as a radical thinker that is the one that is least voiced, because it's the one that until recently has been the hardest one to talk about, and that's Milton on divorce. So his idea, which must have come about partly through personal experience, but also through a lot of reading, that marriage was a companionate matter. It wasn't meant merely for reproduction, and that people had to get on with each other. There's no doubt that he does see this in his divorce treatises, of which there are several, from a male-centered point of view. But in the poem, Eve is treated with a good deal of subtlety and sympathy. I don't think there's any getting away from that. And so in the course of Paradise Lost, Satan as hero with whom we have sympathy is gradually displaced with Adam as hero. But it's also Adam and Eve. And it's Eve's willingness to sacrifice herself as a way of getting back at Satan's awful triumph, that there's a sort of, if not an apotheosis, a very strong and impressive elevation of a female character as offering a kind of heroic virtue. That seems to me to be a very important dimension. We haven't got to Milton's singular conception of the Son. He doesn't call him Christ. He seldom calls him Jesus. And so that's another matter. But I've said enough. And perhaps Nick wants to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And I also, I mean, it is where Milton learns from Shakespeare, I think, as well. And that he incorporates psychologically complex and plausible characters who you may not necessarily admire, but you sympathize with because you're given insights into their psychology. And I think with Satan, Milton's learned a lot from Shakespearean characters like Richard III, Macbeth, and with Eve as well. I think but giving her a fully complex psychology. I think he started out, his original idea when he was young was that he was going to write a drama about the fall, a tragedy. And so you can see, I think part of the brilliance of Paradise Lost is the way he incorporates the kind of the architecture of tragic drama into a classical, the shape of a classical epic poem. And I think that a lot of what the romantics would see as sympathy for the devil, I think, is also the kind of sympathy we might feel for some of Shakespeare's tragic heroes as well.
Yes, and I do think that the view of sympathy for the devil was a powerful way of understanding the poem, so that when Stanley Fish came along and said, well, no, it's a more complicated maneuver and it's designed to effect a kind of reformation in the reader, Fish himself was kind of being a Satan in the tradition of interpretation of the poem, which I think is a nice or even ironic paradox. But I think most people feel that the sympathy, the degree of sympathy in the poem is not finally dispelled. It isn't corrected in the way that fish would have it, so that it is an epic poem of two major dimensions, of fallenness and the quest for redemption, or indeed a return to innocence, and that's I believe how we should accept it. I don't think it works in literary terms to try to force a singular, even a dialectical resolution. Although Milton, as somebody well taught, well versed in logic, would have understand dialectical progression, and he theorizes contrariness in Areopagitica, his theory of toleration. If you know, which William Blake will eventually pick up on. Without contraries is no progression.
Yeah, so I'm gonna, maybe this is a little too like inside literature, but I'm gonna throw this thought I had out. I mean, I'm sort of hearing in these two Satans, I'm hearing Odysseus in Dante in the Inferno, which essentially his crime is that he, wanted to strive and seek and find and not yield. And then, of course, there's this exact same figure put heroically by Tennyson, whose great virtue is that he wasn't good at being good. And what was good about Ulysses for Tennyson is that he kept striving and sort of was always a rebel. And it seems like this, this has been a problem for, very enlightenment-minded readers of the Odyssey, at least since there has been an enlightenment, that Odysseus seems to contain these two poles, and we can celebrate him and make him out to be the devil, at least put him in hell, the way Dante does, and then Tennyson imagines him, sailing off into the sunset. And it seems that Satan, the great rebel, has that same. Do we want to condemn him for not doing the right thing, or do we want to celebrate him for not being bounded by lesser conceptions of the good?
That seems to me to be a very accurate and impressive synthesis. Nick?
Yeah, well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think. I guess we come. I mean, and this relates to what Nigel's saying about the sun as well. To what extent? I mean, there was at the most recent Milton conference that Nigel and I were both at. Nigel took part in a roundtable discussion of is Paradise Lost a Christian poem? The discussion was had with some seriousness, and indeed some quite angry discussion at times. But it's a serious question, I suppose, in that the great Milton critic John Carey would have it that Paradise Lost isn't really a Christian poem because it's not interested in Christian ideas. It's more interested in Homeric ideas, or if you like, or even pagan values, than it is in the sun as a figure of redemption. And Carey would suggest when Milton goes on to write Paradise Regained, which sounds like a sequel, but in fact isn't. It's a narrative poem about Jesus being tempted in the desert by Satan. It's not a poem that focuses on the great Christian moment of the Passion and Christ's sacrifice. It's on a kind of heroic form of behavior, a resistance of temptation, rather than a giving in that we might associate with Christian values, or a kind of acceptance of suffering. So it is a question, and maybe that's one of the more radical features of the poem in a way, and it doesn't. That's why any Orthodox critic like C.S. Lewis, for instance, who's tried to argue for an Orthodox Milton, sort of Anglican Milton, will always struggle to do so, because you can't reconcile some of the aspects of the poem with that kind of Orthodox Christianity.
I do need to jump in here and say, Nick, one of the key features from your book that I didn't know was that, Anglican Christianity of Milton's childhood was actually quite Puritan. We're imagining when we're thinking of the Church of England in the early 17th century, we're thinking of the Church of England, and the way you have found it in the historical sources, it sounds much more like what you would find in Puritan congregations, or indeed in Massachusetts. And this tension between radicalism and orthodoxy. I mean, I grew up, as the listeners know, I grew up raised Calvinist. For me, radicalism and orthodoxy were the same thing. And I think Milton, that called to Milton, and I teach my students that, Emerson was kicked off Harvard's campus, and now Harvard names buildings after him. Radicalism can become the new orthodoxy, and that may or may not vitiate it of its power. I don't know.
Well, you're right to say that. I mean, one thing we haven't discussed so far, one of the beliefs that Milton develops in opposition to the Calvinism that is dominant in his youth, is a belief in free will, which is absolutely crucial to Paradise Lost. The long debates between God and his angels, and between God and Adam, and between Adam and Eve, over free will. And every time Milton insists that creatures are made free and their actions are their responsibility. And so his rejection of predestination, which really comes, interestingly, to the fore around the time he writes the divorce tracts that Nigel mentioned earlier, and then goes on to write Areopagitica, his great defense of the free circulation of ideas. That's when his defense of free will becomes fully manifest and becomes one of his most important principles. So and I think that is a key part of Milton's radicalism in his own period, even though it also aligns him with some quite orthodox people in the Church of England who are also reacting against Calvinism themselves. And that's one of the reasons the Civil War breaks out in the first place, because of attempts to impose a less Calvinistic religion on the English and Scottish people. But Milton comes at free will from a different angle from the Orthodox Anglican version.
Those free willing Anglicans were also very known as the Arminians, were very also interested in the strong authority of bishops, especially the primate of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it's as a total religious polity or outlook, it's very different from Milton's position. We don't even know that Milton belonged to a particular church. You might think of him as a church or a sect of one in the end. And the more you dig into both Paradise Lost and the prose writings, a number of very alternative or distinctive religious views, such as the belief, the position known as mortalism, that the soul dies with the body and stays with it until the sound of the last trumpet and the general resurrection, which will become a more widely pursued belief, even in the Church of England in the 18th century, is a significant presence in Paradise Lost. In all of this, surely we have to ask the question: what did Milton have to do with the radicals of his day, who through the process of being filtered by generations of historians, have been put into groups? Milton was a civil servant in what today would be called the Foreign Office of a revolutionary regime, but it was a republic run by what remained of the ruling elite, the gentry, and some aristocrats, but wearing very different hats. There was the House of Lords was actually abolished. So it was an elite, and what's his relationship, we might ask, with the more radical groups who found themselves in opposition? And this is something that has much concerned Nick, as well as myself and many other people. there are two ways into this. One is that if you read between the lines, he had doubts about the protectorate, and that is much debated. And I'd like to know where Nick has gotten with that one. And then on the other hand, can he be connected with the Levellers?
Well, I mean, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Nigel, but I think after Milton was employed by the Republican government, I think his first commission was to write a polemical tract against the Levellers, which he never did. Yeah,
which he didn't do. Yeah,
yeah. So he didn't do it. In fact, he wrote one against the Irish instead. That was in the end his first, although it was anonymous, an attack particularly on the Irish, the Ulster Presbyterians, actually, as well as the Catholics. So, I mean, when you get into the 1650s, and that's why I found it in some ways the hardest period to work on Milton, when I've been writing the second part of the biography, because you have to sort of, there are certain silences, and I think his decision, if it was a decision not to write against the Levellers, his comparative silence about radical groups in the 1650s where others were attacking them, including Milton's friend Andrew Marvell. Could we see that as Milton having some sympathy towards those radical groups? At the same time, there's little to suggest it in his character or his upbringing or anything that he wrote, particularly that he had any sympathy with them. So again, you're working, say, with silences rather than positive descriptions on Milton's part. And I earlier in my career tried to argue that there was some very striking similarities between Richard Overton, who became a Leveller, one of the leading Levellers in the late 1640s, between his ideas about mortalism, about the death of the soul with the body, and the ideas that Milton develops around 1643-4 when he's writing the divorce tracts. And that mortalism, as Nigel says, you can trace into Paradise Lost. But again, there's no evidence. There are orthodox sources from which Milton could have gleaned that. There's no particular evidence that he was reading someone like Richard Overton, or that he was reading the Levellers at all. So, I mean, it's one of the vexed issues. The great British Marxist historian Christopher Hill wrote a book called Milton and the English Revolution in 1977, where he argued that Milton did somehow imbibe ideas from the radicals, but at the same time had complete distaste for them as a kind of, in class terms. So Hill was kind of himself caught in a kind of dilemma there, in which he saw Milton as somehow influenced by these radical ideas, but at the same time very much keeping away from the radical groups themselves. And he wasn't able really to show how those ideas were then transmitted, even though he made very persuasive arguments that there are some similarities between Milton's ideas and those of Levellers and Ranters and others. So it's a vexed issue for sure, and I'm not sure we've got to the bottom of it yet.
But I think things are changing for the better with the knowledge base we have. So first of all, there are two ways of thinking about this. A lot of people involved in the English Revolution were primarily interested in their own religious liberty, and they wanted to see more of it. And it is significant that Milton is connected with and was quite happy to talk to a number of Quakers toward the end of his life, especially his amanuensis, Thomas Elwood, one of the one person in addition to the daughters who took down Paradise Lost when it was dictated to him. And Elwood helped move Milton out of London to avoid the plague and the Great Plague of 1665. And that is, it is significant that that those associations are there. Whether Milton was happier associating with well-born people, or at least prominent London middle-class people like himself, is something that we still need to understand better. The other side of it is the changing nature of radicalism in the period. What is radical in 1642 is by no, that doesn't look radical at all by 1649. And our colleague in Canada, Nicholas von Montzon, has been doing some work. He's been editing Areopagitica for the new Oxford Complete Works of Milton, and has recovered what was thought to be lost due to Second World War bomb damage, the complete archive of the Stationers' Company. And it does seem that Milton appears to be writing on behalf of the smaller scale printers or publishers who wanted a piece of the action by putting out new views. And some of those stationers, we would use the name publisher today, are going to be people who become levelers. I would say they're the ideological wing of the levelers. You'll have people, foot soldiers, men at arms, who are also keen on supporting what the levelers stood for. But there is a connection on a real connection in terms of the idea of liberty and how liberty related to institutional and material life. And we're just beginning to get good at explaining that. That, of course, leads to it might lead you to think about how life was lived from day to day, the relationship between the sexes in households. And that would have interested Christopher Hill a lot. It's social history. There is a profound transformation taking place, and the people acting in the English Revolution were responding to something that had happened to them, and that they were being denied by various forms of religious and political state authority, and they wanted to see it, and they had to see a change. But I think it was profound and ran through their entire life. And Milton's poetry is really good at addressing all of that, even though it's very learned and refined. The Leveller leader, John Lilburne, writing in the early 1650s, so after the defeat of the Leveller cause, does say, and I can't remember whether this is one of his tracts written from exile in the Low Countries or not, but he does explicitly name Milton as a great patriot whom we shall all read, and he was probably referring to something like the tenure of kings and magistrates. But I'm always taken with I'm now blanking on his name, a young German student who visited England in the early years of the English Republic, Christoph Arnold. And he claims he visited many significant people. He was trying to get more money out of his parents, so he was trying to present the view that this was a worthwhile tour. But he apparently met Milton and said some striking things, that he had little time for Anglo-Saxon poetry, the roots of English language poetry, that he thought it was primitive and beyond them in their time. And he thought he was of a very satirical temper. But he did say that this remarkable man had predicted the liberty that he's now enjoyed in England 7 years before it happened. And that must be Areopagitica. That's what it must be. It might also be the divorce tracts, which is a kind of liberty. But I think he means Areopagitica.
All right. Excuse me. We've been talking a bit more than an hour. We have, I actually, in addition to those two introductory questions I asked you, I scribbled a number of other topics. We've covered all of them. So I think all that's left to say is, what do you two feel like as we're rounding out this talk? We need to say. Somehow I didn't manage to mention Ahab, so I'll just save that for a future episode. We have our own American Milton and our own American devil who rebels and whose rebellion is still contested. But I'll leave that for another time. I relate everything to 19th century American literature, as Nigel knows.
You do realize that Princeton, the Firestone Library at Princeton, has Melville's copy of Milton.
Yes.
It is marked up and annotated in the most amazingly telling way. He really understood what Milton was doing.
Yeah, no, of course, this book is a legendary one for me. Sorry. Anyways, now that I've gotten us off track on Milton, what do we? Sorry, off track on Melville. What do we need to say about Milton and his radicalism before we go?
Well, I think interesting Areopagitica, which is the prose work we've mentioned a few times without ever perhaps going too deeply into. I think that almost speaks to the current generation almost as much as Paradise Lost. I mean, I think it's acknowledged to be his greatest work of prose in terms of kind of visionary rhetoric, and Nigel's kind of given us a glimpse into that. But I think it's engagement with ideas about free speech and censorship and how much responsibility individuals should have for the things the knowledge that they encounter and transmit, which then Milton, of course, returns to in Paradise Lost. And in fact, has Eve, going back to what Nigel was saying about Eve, at one point Eve actually comes up with the arguments that Milton himself put forward in Areopagitica for why she should be allowed to go off on her own in the garden, which leads to the fall. So I think Areopagitica, if we need to make sure that Milton's radicalism is still to the forefront of the 21st century, I think Areopagitica as well as Paradise Lost is the way to do that.
Yes. Milton wrote some. They're not. They're little read except by experts. 2 or 3 treatises when at the end of the 1650s, when the English Republic was obviously going to fail and the monarchy would return. And he's trying to set up, in a couple of these treatises, he makes an appeal for religious liberty. And he basically says, if you gather people together in a church as they wish to come forward and be in a church, not telling them to go or requiring them by law, they will establish their own, from their community, they will establish their own terms of betterment. They will establish terms of discussion which become edifying. It becomes he's basically describing it as the beginning of an educational society. Education, of course, being a very important dimension of Milton. And so I think anyone going to Milton should go with that optimism that you can engage in the most complex forms of speculation or read the most complex texts, but something good can come out of it. And I suppose I agree with Nick that for Milton, liberty and responsibility, he'd always say that he's not an out and out libertarian. The view that an individual is free to do absolutely what they want. There has to be some kind of principle of limit. But I think the writings are so magnificent and inspiring, and in and of themselves contain huge educational benefit that you should everyone should read them. The ideals of free speech and free expression in Areopagitica, I think, remain unrealized. We have not found the terms in which his vision can really work. We'd really go back to Eden if that was possible. The idea of making everyone an author, for instance.
Yeah, that's truly wonderful. I guess I have a couple of last things to say, and then I'm probably going to screw up and turn it back over to you again, because I don't really want this conversation to end. The first is, as we've been talking, it suddenly popped into my head the idea to write a sort of very satirical, allegorical reading in which I explained to undergraduates that, of course, God is Charles I, and the Son is Charles II. The devil is obviously Cromwell. I don't know. Eve is John Lilburn, and Adam is the English populace, or something like that. This sort of reading has occurred to me, and what's funny about it, for those of you who haven't read Paradise Lost, is how clumsy and ham-handed it would be, how inadequate it would be, an understanding of this work. The other thing, if there's anyone who's made it all the way through, 70 minutes of this conversation and is thinking, what the hell does this have to do with anarchism? Although I think I've pretty conclusively explained why I'm interested in the English Revolution. One way to think of anarchism, this is how I think of it, this is in some extent how Kropotkin thinks of it, as one of the many late 18th, early 19th century strands of radicalism, of which Romanticism is not separate, is intertwined with anarchism. And when you think about the great conduit of 17th century English radicalism into the late 18th and early 19th century, it seems to me that Milton's prose, but especially Paradise Lost, is the thread. We can say, I know this is a little schematic, but these things sort of went into hibernation during this 18th century Enlightenment period, and then they sprout up again, and the seed that germinates is Paradise Lost. So everyone from Byron to Emerson takes Milton as someone to draw from, and the radical spirit of the 17th century does, and to a certain extent, it is a Miltonic seed that flowers into the radicalism that we know as anarchism, if that's not too flowery a metaphor. And then I guess I want to know what you two think about that, and then I will finally let you go.
Well, I mean, I think you're certainly right to say that. I think the Miltonic influence is huge, and on Romanticism and seeing anarchism as a branch of that. Yeah, I mean, I think for sure, and I think Milton himself. I mean, I think the defense of free will, the vigorous defense of free will, shouldn't be underestimated in Paradise Lost and the influence that's had. So I think, I think that's a novel but plausible kind of tradition, I think, to map. I don't know if Nigel would agree.
Yes, but I also think that it's true that there are some 18th century figures like Samuel Johnson who basically didn't like Milton at all. I think the praise of the poem, nobody wished it any longer, are very grudging. They're very grudging compliments, and he can't abide Milton's republicanism. He really hates it. But there are lots of Milton fans during the 18th century, and there are poets like Thomas Gray, the elegist, who appear to be voicing Miltonic elegiac feeling, with some respect for the fallen cause, and also the Republican and shall we say the more Republican end of the Whig tradition has a strong place for Milton. So John Toland, the free thinker Republican at the end of the 17th century, is responsible for publishing some of Milton's prose works, and that's a very important venture for what follows. So I just think that the awkwardness for the British of having had a full scale revolution in which the order of the monarchy and the church, which had been there for 1,000 years, was overturned. So there's an awful lot for anyone interested in anarchism in its various forms to get out of Milton, and he is one of the most thought-provoking writers I think we have. He always teaches well. Undergraduates love Milton, and so do other readers.
Yeah, that'll be the last thing I'll say, is that if you can read Shakespeare, you can read Milton. You really can, and it is he is a pleasure to read the poetry and the prose. Nigel and Nick, thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.